Tonight on Ukraine Today. Secrets of a peace deal. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy reveals details of a 20-point document aimed at ending the war. Situation on the battlefield. Ukraine's defense forces have withdrawn from Siversk in the Donetsk region. What is happening on other parts of the front line? Radiation threat. The sarcophagus of the Chornobyl Nuclear Power Plant could collapse if Russia strikes again. Foreign policy infighting. Serious disagreements have emerged between Rubio and Witkoff over the peace process and talks with Russia and Ukraine. All this and more, right now. Hello, I'm Volodymyr and this is Ukraine Today. Please subscribe, like this video, and let's get to the news. Let's start with the secrets being revealed. President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelenskyy has spoken publicly about what is inside the 20-point peace plan currently being discussed with the United States, Europe and Russia. I won't go through all 20 points. That would take about 20 minutes or more, especially with comments, but I will focus on the key points. Point 1. Ukraine's sovereignty will be reaffirmed. This one is for those who still believe they can decide Ukraine's future for us. Point 5. The United States, NATO and European signatory states will provide Ukraine with security guarantees that mirror Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. According to Zelenskyy, this point includes sub-clauses, including responsibility for Russia in case of a renewed attack. Point 7. Ukraine will become a member of the European Union within a clearly defined time frame and will receive short-term privileged access to the European market. Point 11. Ukraine confirms it will remain a non-nuclear state, in line with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This is a serious concession, especially given that a nuclear Russia attacked a non-nuclear Ukraine, reinforcing the belief that nuclear weapons might have deterred the Kremlin's imperial ambitions. Point 14 deals with territories, and frankly, things there remain unclear. But point 15 states that once future territorial agreements are agreed upon, both the Russian Federation and Ukraine commit not to change them by force. Any doubts about Russia? Exactly. Point 18. Ukraine is to hold elections as soon as possible after the agreement is signed. What's missing here, for me, of course, are elections in Russia. Not Putin staged re-election with fake opponents, but real ones, open, fair and democratic. Point 20. Once all parties agree to the deal, a full ceasefire comes into effect immediately. Personally, I believe a ceasefire should be the first step, allowing real negotiations without the destruction of war, but maybe I'm wrong. In any case, President Zelenskyy stressed that this is only a preliminary draft of a basic framework to end the war. So changes are very likely. We are watching closely. And now, a closer look at what's happening behind the scenes of the peace talks.
Talks without a breakthrough, but still a chance for peace. The head of the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense assessed the prospects for a peaceful resolution of the war as cautious but positive. In an interview with Forbes, Kirill Budanov noted that his personal participation in the negotiations allowed him to gain a deeper understanding of the real intentions of the American side. Not only from the officially stated demands, but also from the signals that the White House team sends between the lines, so to speak.
In fact, they gave the process new momentum and energy. I can say that I look to the future with optimism. This is a multilateral and very complex process, not just bilateral negotiations.
Positive signals are also coming from the head of state. According to Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the work of the Ukrainian delegation with representatives of the US president was informal but focused and productive.
There are now prepared drafts of several documents. In particular, there are documents on security guarantees for Ukraine, on reconstruction, and on a basic framework for ending this war.
The president emphasized that the wording of these documents has been formulated in such a way that they address the goal of truly ending the war and prevent any renewed aggression in the future. According to him, every round of negotiations and every meeting strengthens the protection of Ukraine's interests.
The participants in this, not exactly a peace process, are beginning to take shape. Because although it is called that, in reality it is a coalition of resistance that is taking shape. And it is becoming clearer who is actually able to contribute something real to this spectacle, which is in fact something else entirely. What role does Europe play here? What role does Ukraine play? And what roles do Turkey and Qatar play as well? And suddenly it turns out that this is not the show that Trump and Putin actually had in mind. And I think this gives a lot of hope, because the fact that Europe has invested 90 billion euros, wow, to me that's really serious. And apparently for the United States, this is also serious, and they see that all their attempts to push Europe away from the negotiating table and just deal with Ukraine one-on-one, well, it's not working, it's not happening, because Europe has invested in Ukraine, and now Ukraine is a real player and Europe is a real stakeholder. Therefore, this is a situation where apparently they decided to formalize what Ukraine, Europe, and the United States are all willing to agree to.
Donald Trump, as always, remains optimistic. Answering a journalist's question at the White House, the US president stated that negotiations between Ukraine and Russia are ongoing and, according to him, are proceeding normally.
The United States is not a security guarantor for a number of reasons. The security guarantor is Ukraine plus Europe, and those countries in Europe that are willing to support Ukraine, not just those that are part of the EU or simply located on the continent, because there is enough wealth, money, and resources that can be invested in Ukraine, starting with 90 billion, which could seriously undermine Putin's plans and harm Trump's plans. So that's how it is. This dynamic is now becoming very clear here. And again, I'll finish with what I started with. Ukraine is the main character here, the main hero in this play.
But despite the positive signals, the path to peace still comes up against the most difficult and fundamental issues. Yes, peace has indeed become closer, but not because Russia has changed its position, but because the pressure on it has increased. This is what the president of Finland, Alexander Stubb, says. According to his assessment, about 95% of the parameters of a potential agreement have already been discussed. Fundamental issues remain unresolved.
The Russian economy is actually not coping very well. They have zero growth, their reserves are depleted, they have high interest rates and high inflation. And the situation is not improving.
But is Ukraine really close to peace? And more importantly, will Russia agree to peace? A question that so far remains unanswered. The main sticking point remains the issue of territory. According to US Vice President J.D. Vance's envoys, the aggressor country insists on controlling the Donetsk region. Ukraine, on the other hand, sees such demands primarily as a threat to its own security. Even if in behind-the-scenes discussions, it is acknowledged that scenarios involving lost territories might be considered in the long term. He also listed other, albeit less central, but still extremely sensitive topics of the negotiations. These include control over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, possible management formats for it, the fate of ethnic Ukrainians and Russians on both sides of the front line and borders, as well as the issue of Ukraine's reconstruction.
Meanwhile, inside Russia, a chemical plant is on fire in the Tula region after a Ukrainian drone attack. We are talking about the Yefremov synthetic rubber plant. Its products are used by the occupying army, which makes the facility a fully legitimate military target. Up to 200 attack drones per day. That's how many one Ukrainian defense company, Firepoint, can currently produce. The defense forces demonstrate the effectiveness of UAVs every single day. Next, details on Ukrainian weapons, results on the battlefield and future prospects.
11 units. That's the average number of Ukrainian UAVs that crash or hit their targets on Russian territory per day. 2025 has set a record for the number of attacks on Russia.
Did you see the drone or not?
The address is on fire, damn it. They blew up the address.
The number of UAV attacks in which a drone crashed or reached its target in Russia in the incomplete year of 2025 has increased by 33%. There were about 4,000 of them. This year alone, drone strikes have been recorded in at least 49 regions of Russia, as well as in the annexed Crimea and Sevastopol. Drones even reached Siberia, but in most cases we're talking about border regions. 57% of all drone attacks in 2025 occurred in the Belgorod region.
Ukraine is increasingly striking Russia with drones. For almost all drone and missile strikes on Russia carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces today, weapons made in Ukraine are used. These are shots of a recent Ukrainian UAV strike on the Stavrolen petrochemical plant in Budyonnovsk, Stavropol Krai.
Look. It was even brighter.
What a blaze that is. That's what we saw tonight. Until 3 a.m. They've already hit the plant 5 or 6 times.
Stavrolen is an industrial enterprise in the chemical and petrochemical sector. Ukrainian drones carry out such strikes systematically. Since August 2025, Ukraine has begun actively shelling Russia's oil refining infrastructure. This has led to a fuel shortage. The production volumes of Ukrainian UAVs are growing at an incredible pace. Even before the start of the full-scale invasion, the Ukrainian company Firepoint did not exist. Now, at a secret factory, up to 200 strike drones are produced daily, which has allowed the defense forces to carry out 60% of all drone strikes against the occupiers. The cost of the drones plays a key role in production. That amounts to about 50%, $1,000, which is almost 3 times cheaper than the Russian kamikaze drone Shahed. The Ukrainian company is completely autonomous and has deliberately refused to use components from China and the USA.
We adhere to the principle that no one can influence the weapons we create.
The commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Sirsky, also spoke about the important significance of strikes on Russia with Ukrainian weapons. Ukrainian drones have caused damage worth tens of billions of dollars.
In addition to actions on the front line, Ukraine is systematically increasing pressure on the enemy deep within its territory. We are successfully striking Russia's critical infrastructure using deep strike capabilities. As a result of these strikes, Russia's direct and indirect losses since the beginning of the year amount to a total of $21.5 billion. Oleksandr Sirsky, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine.
In addition to strikes by domestically produced drones, Ukraine has recently begun launching missile attacks on military infrastructure targets within Russian territory. And these missiles are also domestically produced. The Flamingo is already being used in combat, although the manufacturer, Firepoint, does not confirm specific targets.
At the beginning of the war, Ukraine mainly relied on its old Soviet-era arsenal. Western military support has helped modernize the country's armed forces, but now it is a world leader in the development of unmanned systems, such as robots and drones. Now, domestically produced cruise missiles are adding to Ukraine's arsenal of long-range missiles.
U.S. military support is very unstable and expecting Ukraine cannot count on reliable security guarantees from its overseas partner. That is why Ukraine's production of its own weapons and strikes on Russian territory are almost the only real way to ensure security guarantees.
In Moscow, Russian police officers involved in the torture of Ukrainian prisoners of war were killed in explosion. Near a police station, an unknown attacker threw a device into a police vehicle. 2 officers were killed on the spot, and 2 more were critically wounded. Ukraine has increased both the number and quality of strikes on Russia's strategic targets. Over the past week alone, -2 Russian generals. In addition, Russia's Shadow Fleet has also come under attack.
On December 22nd, around 7 a.m., a car exploded in a courtyard in the south of Moscow. By about 9 a.m., it became known that Lieutenant General of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, Fanil Sarvarov, was killed in the explosion of this car. This is already the second news of a Russian general's death in the past week. So, as expected, Russian propaganda is starting to drown in accusations against the authorities.
Regarding the blown-up general in Moscow, I've already lost count of how many were blown up on the streets of the capital or St. Petersburg. The bill is big. It's clear that a whole special solution was thought out, and they approached it very intelligently.
Ukraine has not officially confirmed its involvement in the death. Zarvarova However, journalists from the publication Bild suggest that this is the work of the Ukrainian special services. And if the Ukrainians are behind the general's murder, then the intention may be to destabilize the Russian general staff and society.
The message is this: we will get to you all, and for all Russians, we can bring the war to Moscow at any moment. Such assassination attempts, in addition to the targeted killing of an officer who was responsible at the highest level for training highly qualified military personnel, have several other effects: destabilization among Kremlin officials, internal decay within Russian society, and a signal that Russians will gain nothing by trying to establish relations only with the Americans while leaving the Ukrainians out.
A few days earlier, during another attack on a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker in the Mediterranean Sea, Russian General Andrei Averyanov was likely killed.
Averyanov is responsible for shadow deals, assassinations, explosions, espionage in EU countries, sabotage, and so on. He is also behind the downing of Prigozhin's plane, the poisoning of the Skripals, and so on. He carried out operations abroad on Putin's orders. He moved around the EU on vessels belonging to the Shadow Fleet.
Russia has still neither confirmed nor denied the information about Averyanov's death. And while the information about Averyanov's elimination still needs confirmation, when it comes to the so-called elimination of Russian Shadow Fleet tankers, everything is, of course, self-evident. Meanwhile, the Kremlin claims that Kiev's attacks on oil tankers will not achieve any results and will not disrupt supplies.
This will not lead to the expected result after all. It will not disrupt any essential supplies, not at all in the end. It will only create an additional threat. There will definitely be responses from our side.
At the same time, the real consequences of these attacks exist, have existed, and as they say, will continue to exist.
What does this achieve? Well, first of all, it significantly reduces the capabilities of the Russian Shadow Fleet to transport and export raw materials, namely oil. This, in turn, means a reduction in the flow of petrodollars into the budget, real currency that is then directed specifically toward the war against Ukraine. The Russian Shadow Fleet is no longer operating as efficiently as it did, for example, a year ago.
In addition, attacks on Russia's Shadow Fleet are also a reputational blow to Russia.
But there is also a reputational aspect to this. Why is everyone so worked up about Russia? Because this reputational aspect is tied to something that has never happened during the existence of the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, in such a way that its fleet is being humiliated across several seas. So, in summary,
no less painful, particularly in terms of reputation, is the blow to Russians. Attacks on airfields deep in the rear.
Enemy Su-30 and Su-27 fighter jets have been hit. Video and details of the unique GUR operation in Lipetsk. The SBU struck 2 Russian Su-27 aircraft at the Belbek airfield.
So, if you face reality, things aren't exactly going well for the Russians. But if you deny this reality, then the loss of generals is no big deal, and the loss of the Shadow Fleet won't disrupt supplies or lead to any consequences.
Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling the truth about Russia's war. Click the link in the description to become our sponsor. Now's the time to subscribe, like this video and share it, so more people can see the truth. Thank you, and glory to Ukraine. Over the past 24 hours, Russia has lost at least 1,090 troops killed and wounded. That brings total Russian losses since the full-scale invasion to 1,200,370 personnel. In the same period, Ukraine's defense forces destroyed 3 tanks, 4 armored combat vehicles, 45 artillery systems, and dozens of other pieces of enemy equipment. Ukraine's defense forces have withdrawn from Siversk in the Donetsk region, according to the General Staff. Russian forces advanced due to overwhelming manpower and constant pressure by small assault groups under difficult weather conditions. The city remains under Ukrainian fire control. More details from the battlefield in our report.
Peace Russian style. The occupiers attacked Ukraine again all night with drones and missiles. Peaceful settlements and ordinary people's homes were under enemy fire. The Russians launched more than 650 drones and dozens of missiles at Ukraine. Energy and civilian infrastructure were targeted in at least 13 regions.
Russia is a country for which war is now the norm. This is the meaning of its continued existence, and to some extent, even its survival. The Russian leadership does not see any other future for itself, at least in the medium term.
On the front lines, Ukrainian units continue to hold their positions. Over the past day, the defense forces struck 7 important targets belonging to the Russian invaders. The epicenter of the fighting in Donetsk region is the Pokrovsk agglomeration, and in Kupiansk, the Russians are trying to push into the central part of the city, but the situation remains extremely tense in other areas as well.
Right now, Russian occupiers are carrying out a plan to infiltrate their sabotage groups into Huliaipol and have in fact reached the center of this city, which is key for organizing further logistics with railway lines in the Zaporizhzhia region. In the Siversk direction, Russian occupiers have captured more than 170 square kilometers of territory just this month and now almost completely control the city of Siversk itself, having reached the right bank of the Bakhmutka River. And at the same time, they have moved beyond the kill zone of the Bakhmutka lowlands.
At the same time, Russian generals and intelligence services embellish their reports on the situation at the front for the dictator. He believes that Russia is supposedly capable of defeating Ukraine, according to the Financial Times. As a result, under the influence of fake information reaching the Kremlin, Putin refuses to accept favorable terms for ending the war that are being offered by the US president.
Putin is given information exclusively through rose-colored glasses, such as that Kupiansk has already been taken 3 times. As they like to say, liberated and encircled, and that Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad are completely controlled by Russian troops, and so on and so forth. In other words, all this data is significantly embellished for him. Some of the generals receive the title of Hero of the Russian Federation for this, and then they just disappear somewhere.
Meanwhile, Ukraine is expecting a new batch of weapons, and at the meeting of the Czech Security Council, they will discuss the prospects of the supply initiative. Artillery ammunition. France will also deliver to Kiev the first SAMP-T air defense missile system, the latest version already in.
For example, the advanced SAMP-T system is fully capable of effectively intercepting incoming targets at extremely low altitudes, just above the sea level, and at incredibly high supersonic speeds. For instance, it has been practically confirmed that this system can intercept a missile at an altitude of 5 meters above sea level at a speed of 3,500 kilometers per hour. Even such performance has not been demonstrated by...
While Kiev is receiving real assistance, Lukashenko continues to dream. The self-proclaimed president of Belarus stated that Putin could give him up to 10 missile systems. Oreshnik.
Where would Belarus, some pocket puppet of Lukashenko, get 10 Oreshnik systems from? Well, of course not. Absolutely not. It's all a sham and manipulation, done solely to give the appearance of significance. And to create a certain degree of threat for Lukashenko's regime, so that he feels more confident and stable, like under a placebo effect.
While Lukashenko is just throwing words around, China has deployed more than 100 intercontinental ballistic missiles. Beijing continues to build up its nuclear capabilities and prepare military scenarios for the takeover of Taiwan.
Russia's attempts to plunge Ukraine into darkness and cold could have far more serious global consequences. The sarcophagus at the Chornobyl Nuclear Power Plant could collapse if Russia strikes again. This was stated by the plant's director in an interview with agency France Press. He noted that after a previous Russian attack, the structure lost several of its key protective functions. Radiation levels at the site remain stable and within normal limits. For now. Due to Russia's strikes, consumers in the Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, Kharkiv and Chernihiv regions are still without power. Stabilization outages remain in effect across many parts of the country. And finally, what looks like the beginning of a rebellion against Trump. The US Senate has approved a 2026 defense policy bill that contradicts the president's ideas. On top of that, infighting is growing within Trump's own circle. Serious disagreements have erupted between Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff over the peace process and talks with Russia and Ukraine. All the details next.
Americans are rebelling against Donald Trump and forcing him to make decisions that are unpopular for him. On Monday, December 22nd, Trump signed the much-delayed National Defense Authorization Act, which determines how $900 billion of the defense budget will be spent. Its adoption had been delayed since September of this year.
Now, as the new year begins and defense budgets are being approved, well, they aren't voting for what Trump is asking for, but sometimes for those versions and those wordings that in some ways contradict the current administration's line.
The document contains provisions that directly contradict the new national security doctrine proclaimed by President Trump. With this law, Congress is effectively limiting a number of the Pentagon's powers, prohibiting it from acting independently on many sensitive issues.
Politicians are people who think about how to get re-elected. And now, seeing these results that the local elections showed in early November, and let me remind you that in the US in a year, in November 2026, there will be the so-called midterm elections, which are elections held in the middle of the presidential term. And during them, the entire House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate will be elected. And in these elections, it is quite possible, judging by the results, that a scenario could emerge that would be rather unpleasant for Trump, where the Democrats could take both chambers. And then the possibility of even a third impeachment for Trump could open up.
There is no unified position among the top members of Donald Trump's team.
According to the American press, there are currently 3 groups of influence over Trump within the United States government. The first is headed by U.S. Vice President J. Devins. This group also includes the Secretary of the Army, Briscoe. This group is referred to as the isolationists. This is the group that says we should not get involved in the war between Russia and Ukraine on either side. In other words, we should distance ourselves from this war as much as possible and focus on our own advancement.
American journalists report that there are serious disagreements between U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff regarding negotiations with Russia and Ukraine.
And the other group, this group is informal. It's the group of that same Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, Trump's daughter's husband, Ivanka Trump, is also included there. These are Trump's business partners who don't think in terms of state interests, but rather in terms of business interests, in terms of profit, in terms of deals. And these are people who are susceptible to material rewards. Accordingly, Russia was able to establish a dialogue with them and explain that it is more beneficial for the US to be with Russia than against it.
It is precisely this that experts associate with the current warm dialogue between Russia and the US, which is accompanied by mutual courtesies and gifts.
That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Thank you for your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment and share. See you next time.